Hello and welcome to the third and final part of this fine art series, which I have called Where, Why and How. The first episode was called Where. It was based in London and it was following me taking the actual photographs on location. Part 2, that was Why. It was me back in the office showing you the editing decisions about why I edit the images the way that I do. And then finally, we've got this video, which is called How. This is going to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to post-process these fine art images. Now, before we delve into the detail, I want you to think of this video as something slightly different, okay? Without getting on my high horse, this is not another Photoshop tutorial. If you see this video all the way through to the end and you're listening and you're paying attention, you're not just going to learn one new tool. You're going to learn an entirely new way of editing. About 10 years ago, I used to look at fine art images by Joel and other people and think, that is unachievable. I'm never going to be able to create images like that. But fast forward, and a lot of mistakes and a lot of practice, I can achieve high quality fine art images. Now, if you're new to my channel, then you can just watch this series of 3 videos and it will bring you completely up to speed with how I edit my images now. But if you found my channel from years ago, then you'll know that I actually used to edit these images in a completely different way. Now I use the Artisan Pro Panel, which is a plugin created by Joel Chinchilla, which we'll get into in a bit more detail. I'm going to try and break it down. I'm going to use a very simple example and I'm going to show you the entire workflow. So let's get into the detail. Right, I am an avid Adobe Lightroom user, but I've just got the raw file and I'm just going to drag it straight into Adobe Camera Raw Photoshop. So we're not using Lightroom for this, it's not necessary. And as you'll see here, this photograph was taken in London, not the ideal conditions. It was shot with a Canon EOS R, and I think I was using a 24mm tilt shift lens. That's not so important for this image, but the reason I use prime lenses is because I'm just trying to get the sharpest possible image straight out of camera. But you'll see all I've done here is ticked remove chromatic aberration and used profile corrections. Other than that, I try to get the exposure and everything right in camera, and therefore you can see the sliders are just where they were to start with. Okay, so we'll just click open. Now in parts 1 and 2 of this series, I captured and edited a lot of photographs. I'm not going to show you the workflow for a difficult image because I think that might be a bit overwhelming and I might lose some people. So my intention is for this video to be completely understandable for a beginner. Lots of straight lines, no curves, no real complications. So this is the image here, and this was shot with, like I said earlier, a 24mm tilt shift lens. So it's relatively cropped in. So my first intention, before I get into any of the detail of selections and editing, is to remove distractions. I would say that this in the bottom left, this is a distraction. And at the current exposure on the right hand side, this part of the reflection in the window is also a distraction. But other than that, I would say it's a pretty clean, tidy image. But I was there running a workshop and one of the other participants was shooting much, much wider. So if you take the exact same scene, we were stood next to each other, he was shooting wider, you can see all of a sudden we've got some distractions each side of this centralized building. And then we've got all of these spotlights in the building on the right hand side. So before I get into any of the detail, these are the sorts of things that I would clean up. Everybody will see distractions differently. So it's an interesting experiment when you show a photograph to people. Ask them, what gets your attention? And it's normally distracting elements or anything that is very high contrast. So they're the sorts of things that I would clean up before I start the editing process. The other thing to take into consideration is dust spots. Now, I always clean my sensor before I go out, especially if I'm going to be shooting at smaller apertures such as f11. Nonetheless, you might get dust on your lens or your sensor. So I'm typically zooming in to make sure that there are no dust spots. And this image looks pretty good. I did clean my sensor before I went to London that day. Okay, so how would I go about cleaning these up? In the olden days, I'd probably just use the clone stamp, but because I've got the latest version of Photoshop, I would typically rely upon AI. And I know it's a divided subject, but AI does have its purposes. Previously, I would use Content Aware tool, which broadly speaking uses content within the photograph to clone elements. When you use generative fill, it's using AI, and then I just click generate. I don't bother putting any text in there. And then AI is going to make a decision about what it thinks I want there. And I've already done this, so I'm just doing it again. Hopefully it's going to get exactly the same results, but previously it just created a very clean window. So depending on the speed of your computer and your internet connection, you can see that has done a perfect job of removing that. And then I'll add that to the selection. I mean, we can have a go. Let's have a go. Let's see how good AI is doing today. You don't have to be too accurate with your selection. You can just draw around it. There you go. That's a good job. Have a look at that. That saved me a lot of time. Let me show you the most extreme example of generative fill. This image is going to be in a future video, but I'll just show you quickly here. You can see here, lovely, lovely curves, but we have some distractions. Of course, people are entitled to put things out on their balcony. So there's a plant pot over here, and then we've got a massive building going across here. So before AI came along, I would never contemplate cloning this out because of my abilities in Photoshop. I'm pretty good at Photoshop, but I wouldn't say that I could easily clone that out. And I think above the handrail is kind of easy because you're cloning in sky and it's not got a particular pattern to it. But we've got a building behind the glazing here. Very difficult to clone out. Let's just draw around that, come along here, and then as previously we go generative fill. Just hit generate. Don't give it any clues what you want and see what it will do. Mind blown. It needs a bit of tidying up here on the glass for some strange reason, but if you have a look at before and after, whether we choose to like AI or not, and you don't have to use it, but when I'm cleaning up this image, for example, I embrace it for some circumstances. Okay, so we've covered cleaning up the images. Now, two more things before we get going. You've got to make sure that your image is in 16-bit. You don't need to worry too much about what that means, but if you bring in an 8-bit image, when you start to create gradients, you're going to see a lot more banding and it will quickly get ugly. So you can check that. If you go into image mode, you can see here, mine says 16-bit. If yours says 8-bit, then you can change this here. You can bring in an 8-bit file and then change it to 16-bit. 16-bit just means you've got more gradation, more tones of black and white. The other thing is you need to absolutely set on your composition right now, because once we get into the selections, you can't then go cropping and changing it because your selections are fixed, okay? You can crop it once you finish editing, you just can't move this image once you start editing. So on that basis, we need to start looking at selections. If you want to know more about selection zones, I actually made a completely separate video on it. I'll try and link it at the end, but if you watch part 1 of this video, I ran through every single video that I've ever made on the topic of fine art. Before we start making selections, you've got to make the important decision, what selections do I need to make? And therefore you need to ask yourself, how do I want to manipulate this image? You only need to make the selections in the areas of the image that you need to manipulate. Now, if you haven't watched part 1 and 2 of this series already, then I would recommend you stop this video and go back and watch them, because part 2, the why, I show you exactly my thought process about why I edit the images the way that I do. This scene that we've got here, it was towards the afternoon, the sun is coming from the right hand side and you can see here it's hitting this building. This is going to influence the way that I edit this image. Before I start to make the selections, I personally, for this image, I want to manipulate the sky, so I need to make a selection of the sky. I've already said that there are some distracting reflections in the right hand side of the building, but even if they weren't there, I still want to kind of control the amount of light, kind of creating a vignette around the image. So the next selection I need to make is the right hand side of the building. In the middle, I want to emphasize the light falling on this building and kind of bring the viewer's attention into the center of the photograph. In order to do that, I'm going to have to make a selection of the right hand side. In the middle, this spine here, I want to create a bit of a feature, so I'll need to make a selection of that. And I also need to make a selection of the left hand side so that I can kind of create deeper shadows. On the left hand side, I want to manipulate this part of the building, but you can see it's very, very divided up. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we don't want to leave out this part here. So that is a part of the selection that I would also want to make. So if you add up all of this, and in this particular image, these selections are quite easy because they're nice and square edged buildings. They've got lovely straight lines. So the selections on this image are pretty straightforward. So if you add up all of these selections, I've got to make a total of 25. You might think that that's a lot of hassle, but I did actually time myself and I managed to make all of these selections in less than an hour. Now, making fine art images is not a race. Don't think of this as, well, you spend hours and hours making these selections. It's not a race. Take as long as you want, do it as quickly as you want. The selection part of it is not the creative element. This is kind of enabling you to do the artwork further down the line. The selections are very necessary though. There are some tools that will help you make these selections. Luminosity mask will help you select the sky. You could use Photoshop to select the sky. However, you're still going to have to manually make the selections of the building. There isn't any software out there that can differentiate the left-hand side and the right-hand side of this building yet and create a selection from it. So unfortunately, we are still stuck with making manual selections. But one of the most important selections is the sky, so that you can separate the buildings from the sky. So there you go. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how many selections we're making, whereabouts in the image they are, and why. In order to make the selections, you could just use a mouse, but I think if you're doing that for long periods of time, you get like a claw, bad wrist. So I would recommend using something like a stylus and a Wacom tablet. Now I use the Intuos Medium Pro, and they make them in different sizes. I've got this second hand and no regrets at all. Absolutely love this. This makes making selections a pleasurable experience. So if you can afford it, I would definitely get a Wacom tablet. I used to, in my early days, make selections using the marquee tool, but that was a bad idea. It's not very flexible and I regret it. So luckily I discovered the pen tool, and if you don't know how to use a pen tool, I'll quickly cover it here. But again, I made a completely separate tutorial called Fast Manual Selections where I covered that. We'll go into the pen tool. I've got my original drawing here, and if you go into Paths and you click New, and it will come up with path 1. Now whenever I'm drawing something with the pen tool, it's creating a selection on path 1 on the right hand side. I'm going to select my sky first, and because I've got ways of doing things and I'm quite like, this is the way that I do it, I always start in the top left hand corner. I go clockwise around my selection, and therefore I kind of know if I'm on the bottom right hand corner how far through my selection I am. And I always zoom in. This is at 300%, and I'm off the image, so you don't have to worry too much about that. And all you do is, I'll talk you through, because I've got the keyboard in front of me and I've got the Wacom tablet. I use the space bar to pan around. So you hold the space bar and you can drag with the stylus, and you can use the control and plus to zoom in and zoom out, and it's as simple as that. So I'm using the pen tool, and my intention is to get the selection of the sky as accurate as possible. And at the moment I'm zoomed in to 600%. And using the pen tool, you just move along and you click on the edge like so. And don't forget, we're zoomed in really, really far. Okay. Now it's important because what you'll find is when you get into fine art editing, sometimes you will suffer from having halos around the building, and that's because the sky is a bright part of the image, and if you darken the sky down too much, and if you miss your selections by say 1 or 2 pixels, you'll end up with a halo. When I'm making the selection of the sky, I'm doing it exactly on the line of the building, and if I ever run into any problems of halos, then I just expand the selection. So from the outset, I'm not really accommodating halos. I'm avoiding them altogether by getting the selection as close as possible to the building. And because I'm using the pen tool, if you make a mistake, you can hold down control and you can move this. It's very flexible. And then just drag down again and clicking like this. And I'm normally quite a bit quicker than this, but I'm trying to talk you through it at the same time. So I'll go around making my selections. These are all straight lines, so I don't have to teach you any more complicated versions of the pen tool, but if you hold it down and drag it, it will create curves. And then you just hit Control Z and you go back. And what I would say is, I tend to be in the mood for either editing or making selections. If I have a whole folder of images that I'm going to edit, then I tend to batch them. When I'm not feeling particularly creative, I just wake up early in the morning, I grab a coffee and I come and make some selections. This is not a creative process. This is a bit mundane. It's very necessary. And then when I am feeling creative, I'll get all of those Photoshop files, which have already got all of my selections, and then I just start the editing process. So you'll notice that there are gaps here. I'm going to come back to that once I get all the way around the selection of the sky. Using sharp lenses and high resolution camera, if you can, are going to make your life a bit easier. If you use inferior lenses, when you zoom in to 600%, these edges are not going to be very well defined. And that could potentially create a bit of a problem for you. Okay, so we're at the bottom right hand corner, so I know I'm quite far through the selection process now, which is good, because that was getting boring. When you get onto straight parts of the building, the selections are actually quite quick. Okay, so we're around that, come all the way around here. There we go, almost there, top left. This is why going in the same order every time makes a bit more sense, because I can sense that I'm nearly there, almost there. And then once you get back to the beginning, then you make sure that you click the first point, and then that becomes an enclosed circle. So then you just go to path 1 and type in sky. And you just make sure that you save your Photoshop file as you go. So there you go, that is now a path of the sky. In order to turn that into a selection, all you need to do is right click the sky, make selection, and then somewhere along the lines my Photoshop is set to 1.1 pixels. That seems to have worked out for the last 10 images that I've edited on this computer using this version of Photoshop. So I think 1 to 2 pixels is good. So I'll leave that there. And there you go, that is now a selection of the sky. But I actually forgot to do these parts of the window. So let's go back into the sky selection, back into the pen tool. So let's add to this, add that, and then add that in there like that. Once you've created a path, you can save it and you can add to it and you can subtract from it. It's not fixed as soon as you've saved it. Right, here's an important step. It's going to save you loads of time, but more importantly, it's going to give you accurate results. If you were to then make a selection of the building on the right hand side, there is a chance that your sky selection and your building selection won't exactly align. And then you could end up with halos again. So what we can do is we can go to our sky selection, right click that, make selection, okay, select inverse. It's selecting everything but the sky. We want to just have the building on the right hand side. So then if we go into the marquee tool and we're just going to subtract bits. So subtract the building in the middle and subtract the building on the left. So I just made the selection of the building on the right hand side by inverting the sky selection. And then you just go select, save selection, and then you say building, that's not how you spell building. Architect should be able to spell building. Building right hand side, and then you click OK. Now we want to select the building in the middle. Okay, so then we're going to go back to the sky selection, make selection, and again we're going to get rid of the building on the right hand side because we don't want that, and then we don't want the building on the left hand side. What I'm going to do is, because I need to divide this up into 3, I'm then going to save the central selection as central building, and then I'm going to subtract by holding down the Option key on a Mac, but I think that is Alt on a Windows computer. Just going to subtract the left hand side. So now I've got the centralized building right hand side. So again I go select, save selection, central right hand side, save, load selection, central building. Hopefully you're still following. All I'm doing is taking the selections and chopping them up a little bit. Select, load selection, subtract, central right hand side, and there you go, I've got the left hand side. If that was too fast and you didn't get it, rewind the video and watch it again and it will make sense. Now, the gift that architects have given us photographers to make selections is that predominantly on modern buildings there are shadow gaps between the materials. If you have a look at this building on the left hand side, you have multiple materials meeting one another. And without getting a bit too nerdy, materials expand and contract, so you have to leave joints and gaps for them to move a little bit. These gaps in the buildings are the perfect place for you to put your selections. We're going to go back to our pen tool and we're going to go plus. So we've got path 1, starting on the top left hand side, drag that back to the corner, follow that line, and that's how quick it is to select that. And then I would just come over here and I would save that. I think you should give your paths, your selections, a name, because otherwise you're just going to get lost. So don't call them A, B, C and D. Give them something, a name that is a bit logical. I won't make you sit through all of the selections. I'll speed things up a little bit so that we can crack on with the editing. Okay, let's get into the edit. Now, if you watch some of my older videos, you'll know that I used to use layer masks and I used to use layers in Photoshop and then use the gradient tool to kind of drag out some of the shadows from the layer below. When was it? Probably 2020. I started using the Artisan Pro Panel and I haven't looked back. It is definitely the way to edit these images. So in order to follow this, you do need the Artisan Pro Panel, but Joel has created the Artisan Pro Panel originally, I believe, to supplement his own workflow. So the Pro Panel is using things built into Photoshop, and I'm pretty sure he's made tutorials showing you if you want to do this manually using Photoshop without the panel, you can still do it, but it just takes much longer. And I actually think that the Artisan Pro Panel is really cost effective. So the first thing I'm going to do is open the Artisan Pro Panel and I'm going to convert this into black and white. I'm not going to try and create a punchy black and white straight out of the box. As Joel recommends, just convert it into neutral. This isn't going to be a complete tutorial on using the Artisan Pro Panel. And actually, I'm only using a few of the tools. I don't use the luminosity masks because like I've shown you, I create the sky selections manually. The conversions, I use the neutral, black and white. Adjustments, if I'm darkening a sky, sometimes I use the low key. Color, I rarely do some color fine art images, but I have done recently. And then I predominantly spend my time in the depth section of the Artisan Pro Panel. So before I delve into each of the tools and we start to manipulate this image, I tend to work on the sky first. And the reason for that is because you can see here that there's a massive contrast difference. And I would say that the way that I use the panel, and maybe everybody else does, is that I build it up gradually and gradually and gradually. So first of all, let's bring the brightness of the sky down. So if we go over to paths, we'll right click sky, make selection, click OK. And then we'll go over to adjustments, low key, and then I'm going to bring that down. Might bring that down again. And I know I watch a lot of tutorials. Sometimes you'll be watching a tutorial and you think, oh, he's pushed that too far. This sky looks dark at the moment, but it looks dark relative to everything else around it. But once you start to build the image, all of a sudden the sky won't look so dark anymore. And what I tend to do to create the most amount of contrast is I have a graduation on the sky and then I graduate the buildings so that the contrast is kind of overlapping with one another. If you have the skies darker at the bottom and lighter at the top, and you do the same with your building, you're not going to get that contrast point where light meets dark. I've created a bit of a cheat sheet for the Artisan Pro Panel so that you can see exactly what's going on. But Joel has made loads of tutorials about how to use the Artisan Pro Panel anyway, and what all of these tools do. So the top drop down tells you the direction of the gradient. So it's either go left, right, top, down, and he's got diagonals, and he's also got some special effects. And the markers, so you've got darken, 2, 3, or 4. This is the strength, kind of the strength. If you take a bar and you use the number 2, that represents 25% of the gradient. 25% from left to right. That's how far the gradient goes, and then it just diffuses out. If you use the 3 darken, then that reaches 50% of your selection from left to right. And then finally, the strongest darken covers 75% but it never gets to the end. There isn't a 1 because that would be 0, and then there isn't a 5 because that would be 100%. So neither of those are gradients. Not only that, but there's a strength slider at the bottom, and this represents the opacity. So the secret and the workflow to the Artisan Pro Panel is that every time you click one of these buttons on the Pro Panel, it creates a new layer. So therefore, if you make a mistake and you don't want to rely upon just Control Z going back and back and back, if you go to your layers, you'll see here, I can return back to my original sky. This does get overwhelming in terms of file sizes, so you need to keep an eye on this, and once your file size gets too big, then you want to condense them. You want to flatten the layers. And you might think, oh, that's a bit of a destructive workflow. How do I go back to the previous version if I've then flattened all of the layers and I no longer have access to my first iteration? So the workflow is you need to save your Photoshop files at regular intervals. Most of my images, I would say that I've got maybe 5 to 10, maybe 15 versions of the Photoshop file. So this Photoshop file is called More London because that's where the image is taken, and this is version 1. Once I get to a stage where I think, okay, I've reached a point where I may make some silly decisions and I may want to go back, then I'll save it as a V2. This most recent layer is not just a layer representing the changes, that's everything flattened all on one layer. So returning back to the sky, I've made my sky selection and I'm going top to bottom because I want to create a gradient from the top down, and I leave my strength, which is the opacity, at 2. That just seems to be my favourite setting on this. And then I tend to use the middle for the darken, and then maybe one more. Maybe one large one. Okay, so there you go. You'll see here that the layers are stacking up. If I think, oh, I'm not entirely sure if I like that, you can just switch off the layers that went before it, and then you can just toggle that on and off. Have I pushed that edit a bit too far? I don't think so. So then I would just Control E, flatten those down, and my Photoshop file will always have the original, the neutral, and then my latest. Right, so now I feel like the sky is in a reasonable place where I can start to manipulate the buildings and feel a bit more comfortable. Let's tackle the right hand side of the building. So you can see here, this is starting to be a bit brighter than the sky, which is a slightly dangerous position. In terms of the light is coming from the right hand side. It's hitting this building. You might get a bit of bounce. This is reflecting this. But generally, because the light is coming from the right hand side behind this building, I want this to be a very dark building. Load my selection, right hand side, click OK. And then I want to keep the attention in the middle of the frame. So I'm going to be using gradients from the top and from the bottom and from the right hand side. So we'll start with top to bottom. We'll do a darken there, maybe one there. Then we'll go bottom to top. And then you just have to judge whether or not you are pushing anything a bit too far. So I wanted this to have a bit of lightness to it. Let's try diagonals from the left, just a splash of light. It's looking good. I think I want to darken it a bit more because it's looking a bit cloudy. What I don't want in this image is for things to look a bit muddy, a bit middle grey. So then I'm just going to do a batch select, condense those down, which is Control E, diagonal, bottom right. I think that that's in a good place for now. We'll revisit the right hand side of the building in a bit. If you're enjoying this tutorial but you want to stop me and ask me questions, unfortunately that's not how YouTube works. But the good news is that I offer one-to-one tuition in person and online. If you want to learn more about capturing and editing fine art images like this, or this one, or even this one, then head over to my website at benharveyphotography.co.uk and click on workshops for more information. Okay, back to the tutorial. This is going to be potentially the focal point of the image. I want the darkness to be coming in from the bottom of the image and the eye to be drawn to the point of that middle building. Left hand side should technically be the darkest here because the light is coming in from the right hand side. So we're going to start with a bottom to the top, and I want I want some significant darkness to start with, so I'm going with the largest one. Go from diagonal bottom left. Another one of those. I'm going to stop there and then I'll come back to see if I've pushed it too far. This might look really, really dark, but if I click on this and click down here, you can see it's not clipped, it's not gone all the way down to black. Next, I'm going to do the central spine because I actually want to add a bit of a highlight to that. Central spine, bottom to top, darken, darken, and then we'll go top to bottom, and then I'm going to lighten them. There we go. Hopefully you can see the effect that I'm going for there. I'm not necessarily trying to create something that is representative of what's happening in real life. I am manipulating this image to create a piece of art, and it's open to interpretation, but it doesn't mean you can just do anything. It's got to kind of make sense. The right hand side is going to be a bit more subtle. So we're going to go bottom to top, darkening, maybe diagonal bottom right. Kind of want to tone down the highlight. So let's do a right to left. And this is the benefit of this workflow. You can just toggle this on and off, and I think I've pushed that too far because the right hand side of this building should be brighter than the left hand side. So all I've got to do is just delete that layer and I'll stop there, and then maybe I'll add a bit more shadow to the left hand side, but I think I'm going to leave that part there for now. And just to remind myself how far the image has come, I just toggle on all of the edits just to make sure that generally the image is going in the right direction. Okay, let's tackle the building on the left hand side. Right, so what I want to do is I want to make sure that no bright areas are by the edge of the frame. You can see that band 3 and upwards have bright areas quite close to the edge of the frame. So my intention is to select each individual band, create a gradient, therefore creating a bit of depth, but also making sure that there are no bright areas at the edge of the frame. I'm always trying to control where people look because I'm a control freak, and I'm doing that by creating shadows and having the highest point of contrast exactly where I want them to look. How does it look if I do left to right? Yeah, that's more like it. You can see here, as I toggle that on and off, you can see here, this is really working, and I'm drawing the attention into the image by having the highest point here. Paths, bottom band 2. Same again. Let's do left to right. The lighten in the Artisan Pro Panel seems to have a lot more influence. I'm not saying that it's any more than 25% or the strength and the opacity is any different. I think that the lighten just has a different effect on the pixels in an image. You need to be very careful with the lighten. Right to left. There you go. You can see how dramatic that was. In order to get the rest of it darker, I've had to press that eight times, and then I just press the lighten once, and it has quite a significant effect. Let's do the next one. Left to right, darken, darken, darken. There we go. And then I'll do one cheeky right to left, and just, there we go. I'm pretty much just repeating the same pattern. I'm making sure that there are no bright spots close to the edge, and I am being consistent with there being a spot of light, nowhere near as contrasty as my focal point, but subtle midtones kind of drawing you towards the center of the frame. Sometimes you just got to step away for a little bit. Squinting helps, because when you squint at an image, it kind of emphasizes the contrast points. So sometimes if you zoom out on an image like this, and you see it really small, you can see clearly the building on the left hand side needs some work to bring the highlights down. But sometimes you can see, oh, is my photograph a bit muddy, too many midtones, or have I got the balance of shadows, midtones and highlights correct? But it's going in the right direction. Happy with it so far. You remember at the beginning of the video and I said, oh, the sky might be a bit too dark. Well, if you ever look at the brightness of the sky now, it doesn't look too dark at all, does it? You've still got that gradual glow happening from the bottom, but it's not competing with the buildings. It's exactly what I wanted. So it's not a bad first go. I'll probably return to the sky at the end. And just because I've made 10 selections on that one facade, it doesn't mean that I have to edit them individually. All you have to do is just hold down Shift and you can select all 10 paths, right click, make selection, and now I've got that entire elevation. So if I wanted to brighten up that whole facade, I could do that in one hit. Likewise, if I want to darken it down, I can. But at the moment, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking the top of that building there it's starting to compete a bit with this. So I want it to be really subtle. So I'm going to bring down the opacity and just do one darken. That might have just been enough. Look how subtle that is. Let's start to work on this part of the building, but I think I'm happy with that. It's going to be a very similar situation with this. I'm going to be having graduated filters from the top down so that I'm drawing people into the center of the image. Let's select all of these to get an overall top to bottom darkening. That looks good. Doesn't that look good? But I need to work on the top parts of it here. There we go, that's looking good. Which one was that? 4, we'll do 5. So this is where we've got to. Right, that's the latest edit. And then that's the original black and white conversion. I wouldn't say that this is done. I think we need to do a bit more work on the sky. And generally I try to avoid the tones of the building matching the sky because I want there to be a defined edge. Whatever you do, when you feel like you've reached a point, don't post it on social media. Don't share it. You've become fine art blind by staring at this image for too long. You need to walk away, and generally I come back a couple of days later, and your first reaction to that image is the one that you should listen to. That gut instinct when you look at your image, and if you think, wow, I really went too far on that, you should listen to your gut. Whereas if you come back, which is what tends to happen most of the time, I come back and think it needs a bit more editing. There you go. I think I'm going to leave that image there and take my own advice before I create a thumbnail for this video and share this image. I am going to walk away, come back in a couple of days and see if it needs any refinements. From this video, you can see my workflow, how I use the Artisan Pro Panel, how I approach the edit of the image, and hopefully you agree that it's actually not as difficult as you might think. Yes, I've shown you how to edit this image, and this I would say is quite a straightforward image. But once you've got the principle of this, just practice, practice, practice. If you want to have a go at this yourself, I would recommend photographing a contemporary building with sharper edges. If you try and do awkward buildings, older buildings, such as castles and things, you're going to have a lot more difficult time creating the selections and everything that goes with it. So my advice is start off simple, capture a raw image using the best possible settings of a modern looking building and start there. So there you go. Hopefully this was worth the wait, this part 3 of this series. And if you've made it to the end of this video, then thank you and congratulations, because I guarantee you that you're going to start creating beautiful fine art images. If you've got any questions about the workflow or anything in this tutorial, then let me know in the comments down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed this content, consider subscribing and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.